Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start us off here. Once again, I want to welcome everybody to our webinar. I am Laura Haas. I'm the Dean of the College of Information and Computer Sciences at UMass Amherst. Our webinar today is an AI analysis of racism in sports journalism and college coaching with Assistant Professor of Computer Science, Mohit Iyer of our college. This webinar is the second in our year-long series, Computing and Social Justice, which brings CICS researchers and the public together to critically assess how computing innovation intersects with vitally important issues like racism and bias, civic participation, economic inequality, and citizen privacy. Each webinar focuses on a different technology or application whose impact on society is extraordinary in both visible and invisible ways. As computer scientists, we recognize that technology is central to the issues facing our country and can be an important tool in identifying and maybe even correcting inequality. Today's talk will explore how racism in sports can be revealed using artificial intelligence. Dr. Mohit Iyer has performed computational analysis of over 60 years of sports broadcasts to identify an astonishing degree of racism and unconscious bias in game commentary and the discussion of athletes. In his talk today, he also will describe a new study of racism in college football coaching and the AI tools that he uses in his research. A Q&A will follow his remarks. Please ask questions at any time using the Q&A link at the bottom of the screen, and we will bring them up and try and answer them after his talk. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Professor Mohit Iyer's main research interest is in designing deep neural networks for traditional natural language processing tasks and new problems that involve understanding of creative language. He received his PhD in computer science from the University of Maryland College Park in 2017, where he was a member of the Computational Linguistics and Information Processing Lab. Iyer then spent a year as a young investigator at the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence and joined CICS in September of 2018. It is my great pleasure to turn things over to Professor Iyer.
Great, let me share my screen. Hopefully this is working. If it's not, I'm sure you can tell me on the chat. Okay, great. So yeah, today I'm gonna be talking about two related but distinct studies on analyzing racial bias in American football, specifically focusing both on broadcast commentary as well as coaching, promotion, and hiring practices. So I wanted to start with a quick summary, kind of historical summary of race in American football. So the NFL, which is the professional league in America, was actually unofficially segregated during the Great Depression era. And only around 1950 did you start to have teams with both white and black players on them. But things weren't like they were today back then. Initially, there was a per team max limit on the number of black players that could be on any one team. And, you know, even as we moved on to the 70s and the 80s, where these limitations officially were removed, teams would kind of unofficially maintain them by practices like stacking, in which all of the black players on a team would be assigned at the exact same position, and they would all have to compete for a single spot on the roster. So football has had quite a few racial differences throughout its history, and nowadays it's been getting more integrated across every position, but there are still massive skews in terms of like quarterbacks and running backs as a function of race. So I want to focus a lot of this talk on the segregation that occurs at the position level, both in players and in coaching. So this is a quote from a previous study that analyzed NFL football during the 50s and 60s when it was officially integrated, but these kinds of positional skews started emerging. So positions such as quarterback, center, middle linebacker, and safety were pinned as positions for intellectually capable players. And the common belief during those times was that only white players had the capacity to fill those spots. And this will be a common theme, as we'll see later on, this idea that white players are more intellectually capable while black players are more athletic. This comes up over and over. It's one of the main sources of racial bias in sports commentary and journalism. And so this is even though it manifested itself at the highest level in the 50s and 60s, it has had lasting impacts. So Ozzie Newsome, who played in the NFL and was also general manager afterwards, said, I think the stereotype can affect your mentality. If you grow up not seeing something and hearing something your whole life, that starts to impact you. I can't do this. I'm not good enough to do that. And that becomes a part of your life. And you see this over and over again in interviews with players and coaches. There was this common practice of black quarterbacks playing the quarterback position their whole lives in high school and college. And once they get to the NFL, they're forced to become wide receivers because of this perception that they're not intelligent enough. The quarterback, Warren Moon, had this interview where he said when he got to the NFL Combine, he intentionally ran slower than he actually could to force the scouts to think that he was not as athletic and that he wasn't suited for the wide receiver position, so he could actually play his natural position of quarterback. The same perceptions hold true in reverse for different positions. So for positions like cornerback and running back, white players are often told they're not athletic enough to play these positions. And then there's just bizarre skews, like for kicker, where many of these skills are not necessary. It's a very specialized position. There have been only 4 black kickers in the history of the NFL. So now I'm going to shift over to how commentators kind of contribute to these narratives that are built up at the position level and how they also impact narratives of players specifically and players of certain races. So I'm mainly talking about play-by-play commentators here, the commentators who are describing what's going on in the field during the game. So, you know, the people who say like Tom Brady threw a 5-yard completion to the wide receiver. But they don't just focus on those kinds of low-level details, right? That would be really boring. They mainly, to increase the viewer engagement, build up these high-level narratives of players like that span across many games that often kind of integrate their personal lives and challenges into these narratives. And viewers eat this up, right? The sports media consumption, many people in this country are, you know, reading ESPN or watching YouTube videos or looking at sports on social media or radio shows or so on. And so their perceptions are heavily shaped by the narratives that are put forth by the commentary surrounding these players. And this becomes a problem when the commentators' own biases creep into the narratives that they're building up. So as an example of this, a sports radio show host in last year made this comment about the Jacksonville quarterback, Gardner Minshew. He's even got the look at him. He's basically the guy that like 95% of Jacksonville wants to go drink a beer with. And so, of course, this radio show host would only say that about a certain subset of people, right? And so in his own way, the radio show host is contributing to a particular perception of this quarterback, Gardner Minshew. And just to highlight how big of a problem this potentially could be, there's a huge disparity, a racial disparity in NFL play-by-play commentators, the ones who are, you know, talking about the game and are partly responsible for forming these narratives, and the NFL player body itself. So only 3 out of the 75 NFL play-by-play commentators are Black. But 70% of NFL players are Black. This was published last year in, I think, the Guardian. So this obviously is, some grounds for worrying about the potential racial biases that can creep in to sports commentary. And this is not a new finding, obviously. And in some cases, like your average sports fan is aware of these racial discrepancies and how different players are talked about in the media. There have been many studies in the past at a small scale that have found lots of things. For instance, this, Black players being praised for their athleticism, while white players get praised for their intelligence. And there are many other similar results. So coming closer to my own work, the first thing I'm going to talk about here is trying to scale up all of these studies to a huge collection of games and commentaries, and getting rid of the manual annotation process of actually having a sociologist look at the transcript of the games and code them for various phenomena that are occurring. Now with advances in AI and natural language processing, we can automate a lot of this to some level and get insights from a much larger amount of data. So first, I'm going to start talking about a data set that we collected in an attempt to analyze a racial bias in play-by-play commentary. Then I'm going to talk about some of the highlights of our analyses. I'm not going to go over everything due to the lack of time. And finally, I'm going to shift gears and talk about some preliminary work that we're doing on looking at racial disparities in the coaching ranks. And here we'll shift from NFL to college football. But I'll start with this data set. And this work was mainly done by 2 undergrads at UMass, Jack and Luke, along with a couple of my other collaborators. So Jack and Luke had this nice idea that we can actually get access to a large number of football broadcasts by going on YouTube, because lots of users just upload full-length game broadcasts to YouTube, and I guess the NFL hasn't been great about enforcing their copyright claims, so there's like thousands of games available, not only in the NFL, but also in college football. And so one nice thing about YouTube is that many of these videos are automatically captioned by Google's speech transcription service. So you not only get the video, but also you can get the transcript of what the commentators said for the entire length of the game. So as an example here, we have this play happening, and you see the caption. I'll tell you, Scott Mitchell has really been something today. So Scott Mitchell, I think, is the QB here. And so we downloaded a lot of these games, almost 1,500 game transcripts, and from YouTube. And then we ran some NLP tools to identify all of the players whose names are mentioned in these transcripts. So we essentially ran a named entity recognizer to detect every time names like Scott Mitchell occur in these transcripts. Then we went a little further and linked each occurrence of a name in this transcript to information about that player, what team they were on, what year they were playing, what position they played. So that process looks something like this. I take Scott Mitchell and I link him to this page about with all of this information. Importantly, there's no publicly available database that includes like racial demographic information about these players. And so that was a second step that we had to do to actually perform our analysis. But I just wanted to show a quick summary of what this looks like for a particular player. So with Scott Mitchell, I can extract over this data set of 1,500 transcripts every single occurrence of when he was mentioned by a commentator across many different games. And so you see that I've shown a window of words around each of the mentions of his name. Some of them are focused on the actual play that's happening. So the third one here, that was exactly where Scott Mitchell was looking for Brett Perryman for first down yardage. And others are more associated with these higher level narratives. The team has done well. That's putting it mildly. Scott Mitchell has not missed a beat. That's not actually talking about a specific play, but rather something else. Okay, so the next part I wanted to discuss was how we actually link these players with their perceived race. So we have a lot of mentions of players in this data set, over 250,000 of them. So this is a much larger scale than any of the previous sports sociology studies. And we have about 5,000 unique players in our data set. And so we'd like to figure out for each player, what is their perceived race. And to do this, we turn to crowdsourcing. So many of you might be familiar with Amazon's Mechanical Turk or other such platforms that allow you to post tasks to the platform where crowd workers can complete those tasks and receive payment. So usually these tasks should be fairly simple, like image labeling or something like that. And in our case, we, for every player in our data set, did a Google image search where the query was something like their name, their team, maybe their position, NFL, to really specialize the search results to the particular player. And then we took like the top 5 or so results and showed them to a crowd worker. So given these 5 pictures, we would ask a crowd worker to label the perceived race of the player as either white or non-white. And we had 5 workers annotate the perceived race for each player. The agreement was pretty good. 93% of the time, all 5 workers agreed. And we just discarded the players, the remaining 7% of players from our data set where the annotators, there was some disagreement on the perceived race. So I just wanted to clarify or kind of emphasize that the intent here is not to reify these racial categories, but we're mainly interested in studying whether the perception of a player's race affects how a sports commentator talks about them. Okay, so now on to offering some high-level takeaways of our analysis of this data set. First, the positional skew persists, even though it's like 2020 now. And here, this plot breaks it down for many different positions. You see the first column, the first bar here, quarterback is majority white, and all of the other positions except maybe tight end are majority non-white. And when I say non-white here, the vast majority of non-white players are black. Okay, and one thing that has been studied a lot from like sociologists and sports journalists is the quarterback position, because it's the most prominent, the most visible position. Quarterbacks are generally the stars of the league. And nowadays we have a lot of great non-white quarterbacks playing, but it didn't used to be that way. And in fact, our data set spans games from the 1970s till, I guess, last season. In the 70s, there were no non-white quarterbacks at all. And you can see how only recently has there started being more and more representation at this, the most prominent position on the field. Okay, so the next thing we wanted to do is kind of interface with existing sociology studies. And one really interesting finding from multiple prior research papers was that commentators have kind of naming patterns that are influenced by the demographics of the players that they're talking about. So there's one study that showed that men are more frequently referred to by their last names than women in many different sports, not just American football. And this other study, Bruce 2004, showed that white players are more frequently referred to by their last name than non-white players. And they found this, and then they decided to try and explain why this is happening. They actually conducted interviews with many different sports commentators, and these interviews revealed that some commentators, they weren't aware that they were doing this, but then when asked to explain their behavior, they said things like, white first names sound too normal, so we decide to call them by their last names. But this kind of practice can contribute to racial othering, and in some cases, it's kind of akin to having fun or playing with the names of people from other racial groups. And so these studies were all, again, at a fairly small scale. It required a lot of manual coding on the part of the authors to get these results. But we can look at it at a much larger scale in our data set. And so our results essentially confirm the prior work that white players are much more commonly referred to by their last names than Black players. This persists across many different positions and is particularly striking for quarterbacks, where 20% of the mentions in our data set to white quarterbacks are using their last name only, compared to only 7.5% for non-white quarterbacks. So the remainder of those mentions are either using the full name or the first name. Yeah, that's a pretty striking discrepancy. So the next analysis I wanted to briefly summarize was regarding sentiment patterns. So how do sports commentators praise white players versus Black players differently? And there's been a lot of prior work on how the praise centering around Black players mainly focuses on their athletic abilities, while white players get other types of praise like their intellect or their hardworking nature and things of that sort. So to automatically look at this, we look at windows of text around each mention of a name of a player in our data set. So here we observe Scott Mitchell is surrounded by these words, and we run a sentiment analysis model to detect whether the commentator is talking about this player in a positive or negative frame. And so here our model, which is pretty simple, it mainly is just doing some simple word matching, detects that the word poorly is negative, and so assigns this whole mention to negative sentiment. So admittedly, this is not the most complicated method, and we could use far more fancy methods, but this is also interpretable because it tells us exactly why a particular mention was deemed to have negative or positive sentiment. And so we did some, an assortment of experiments on this sentiment analysis, but I just wanted to offer some insight into what the most positive sentiment words were used for each race, white versus non-white. And so to do this, we measure the ratio of relative frequency. So for each positive word, here in this example, we take the word versatile. We look at what percentage of positive mentions associated with white players included the word versatile, and we take the ratio of that to the same percentage for non-white players. So if this ratio was high, that would indicate that the word versatile is used far more often in a positive setting for white players than it is for non-white players. And so when we look at this across a wide spectrum of positive sentiment words, we see that white players are described with positive words such as enjoying, calm, loving, miracle, cool, perfect, smart. Whereas non-white players, the most positive words are almost exclusively focused on their athletic gift. So speed, gifted, gift. We can see two forms of the word gift in here. Playmaker, natural, monster, wow, beast, athletic, so on. And so one thing that you might comment about after looking at these results is whether the positional skew, right, the fact that quarterback is a majority white position, running back is a majority non-white position, and that these positions are likely described using different words, maybe that's contributing to these discrepancies, and maybe the racial aspect is not as important as the position. So we did the same analysis, but restricted our players to just quarterbacks only. And we basically saw the same results. So white quarterbacks are praised as being smart, safe, excellent, class, cool, and so on. And for non-white players, you see similar words: athletic, ability, speed, wow, awareness, and so on. So that indicates that even if you get rid of this positional confound, there are still discrepancies in terms of how quarterbacks of different races are described by commentators. Okay, so I could say a lot more about our findings here, but I wanted to shift over for the last part to some in-progress work that we're doing on racial disparities in football coaching. And here we're going to shift from the NFL, which we included in our previous analysis, to focus exclusively on college football and the NCAA. So there have been a couple of studies on looking at racial disparities in coaching. This first study, Madden and Ruther 2009, showed that Black coaches have to be significantly better than their white counterparts to be hired as a head coach, specifically in the NFL. And also that when they get to the NFL, Black coaches are more likely to be fired than white coaches, even if they have similar records. And then secondly, many of you might be familiar with the Rooney Rule, which was established in the NFL in 2003, basically as a way to increase the representation of minority coaches in the NFL. And so the rule is, its text strongly urges teams to interview at least one minority candidate whenever they have an open head coach or general manager position. But since 2003, this actually hasn't resulted in really any success at all. In 2020, this season, only 3 out of 32 teams have Black head coaches. And it's really, there's been a lot of articles even very recently about why the Rooney Rule isn't working. But a lot of the times teams just get around the Rooney Rule by interviewing minority candidates, but then just not hiring them. And there's nothing actually enforcing them to make these hires. So it's interesting to look at why the Rooney Rule has failed. And our study here is based around a hypothesis that maybe there's a problem downstream in the coaching pipeline, or I guess upstream. So many NFL coaches get their start coaching in college. So they coach, at maybe Division III schools, then Division II. They work their way up and eventually get to the NFL and finally work their way up to head coach. So we did a quick analysis of the 32 current NFL head coaches, and only 7 of them did not previously coach at the college football level. So this is very important for most coaches to get some training and get some experience. And so this work is in collaboration with my colleagues Alvin and Brandon. And yeah, as I said, we're still doing it, so there's a lot of results that are still to come. But just to motivate this, I wanted to look at a recent hire, the Panthers' new coach, Matt Rule. He has got his start at Albright College, which is a Division III school. So if you're unfamiliar, the college football is broken down into different divisions: Division I, Division II, Division III. And mainly the differences are like the size of the school, the budget that they have for their athletic program. Generally, Division I schools tend to be more well-funded, have much more prominent athletic programs than Division III schools, which are small colleges. They lack visibility and so on. So Matt Rule got started at a Division III school, Albright College, as a linebackers coach. You can see that he moved around to many different colleges: Buffalo, UCLA, Western Carolina. So one interesting aspect that we would like to measure is how a coach's race impacts their ability to change from school to school. So we call this inter-school mobility. But what I'm going to focus on here is rather intra-school mobility, and particularly getting promoted. So moving up the ranks at the same school. So you can see in Matt Rule's career, when he joined Temple, he was a defensive line coach. Then he changed positions to quarterbacks coach. He became the offensive coordinator, and then he came back to become the head coach. So he went through all levels of promotion from a position-specific coach like defensive line and quarterbacks to an offensive coordinator to eventually a head coach. And then you can see that after all of this experience, he was able to finally make it to the NFL and become the head coach of the Carolina Panthers this year. So we wanted to examine automatically at scale if there are any racial disparities in how coaches get promoted and how often or how they move around within the same division or get promoted at the division level and so on. But unfortunately, there's no publicly available data set that allows us to get all this information. The NCAA's page gives you some aggregate stats, but not this kind of low-level information that you would need. So we had to create our own data set again. And this time we essentially mostly manually with some automatic techniques built in, went through all of the official football team websites of every school that has a football program in the NCAA. There's about 700 of these schools. And most of these web pages have coaching rosters where they list each coach for a particular year. They give a picture of the coach. They write out what the position of that or status of that coach is, and so on. So we again used the crowdsourcing methodology that we used for the previous analysis to label the perceived race of the coaches. This task was a little more complicated because we asked the workers to actually go to the official team website, scroll down, find the particular coach, and then provide some labels. But after this process, which was actually more expensive than I hoped it would be, we did create this really large data set. It has about 12,000 coaches across, I think, the years 2004 to 2019, maybe some 2020. And it has a lot of metadata about all of the schools as well as the coaches. So I'm just going to conclude here by offering some quick takeaways of the analysis that we've done so far, and then also conclude with work in progress that we're hoping to do in the future. But first, just talking about representation, this graph looks very different to the player racial breakdown. Here we see that there are way more white coaches than Black coaches. So in this analysis, we decided to specifically focus on white and Black. You can see that there are very few coaches who were annotated as other, and some coaches, the workers couldn't find a photo on the web page. But if you remember the stat from before, 70% of the players in the NFL are Black. Here we see that that's certainly not true when you look at coaching, at least in college. So one interesting thing we noted is that the percentage of the proportion of white coaches increases as you move further down in divisions. So Division I is about 70-ish% of coaches that are white. Division II is getting closer to 75, and then Division III is almost at 90% of the coaches in Division III are white. So we have some hypotheses as to why Division III looks so different here. A lot of it is possibly due to the low visibility of these schools. They are not affected by policies such as the Rooney Rule. Another possibility is that these schools don't need to actually recruit because they're the small schools. They're not intended to be super competitive, and they have very small budgets. And so without recruiting, maybe the need for having minority coaches goes down. And so these are some of the hypotheses we have, but we obviously don't know for sure. On a positive note, the representation of Black coaches has been increasing slowly over the past 15 years. So this just plots the percentage of Black coaches in the data set as a function of time. So you can see that 2005, there's around 15% of coaches that were Black, and now it's closer to 25%. Another bit of analysis we did was looking at the average tenure length at any one school. So white coaches in every division have longer average tenures than Black coaches. So here the bars represent how many years on average did a coach stay at a given school. And another thing to point out here is that the discrepancy is largest in Division III, where Black coaches average tenure length is about 1.5 years, whereas white coaches are upwards of 2 years. So this gap is actually quite significant when you consider that the average tenure length is only somewhere around 2 years at a particular school. Okay, so I wanted to do some amount of breakdown by position, because it is interesting that the same kinds of positional skews we saw with players, right? You know, like white quarterbacks being more prevalent than Black quarterbacks, is also true for many of the coaching positions. So in these plots, the first 4 bars here represent white coaches, and the second 4 bars represent Black coaches, and each color is associated with a different division. So here for head coaches, we see that across all divisions, there are way more white head coaches than Black coaches. The same is essentially true for offensive coordinator, is also true for defensive coordinator. But then when you get into the more position-specific coaches, like running backs coach, you start to see an increase in Black representation. Note that these positions, like running backs coach, defensive backs coach, these are paid less than positions like offensive coordinator or head coach. And so there's also a financial element to this analysis that we haven't gotten around to yet. But one interesting thing about this plot is that you can again see the discrepancy between the higher, more prominent divisions and Division III. So here, for running backs coaches, we see that in Division I, there are more Black running backs coaches than white running backs coaches. But in Division III, there are far more white running backs coaches than there are Black running backs coaches. The same trend holds true for defensive backs coach, and that's just a sample of the positions, but similar trends for other positions as well. So I wanted to conclude by talking specifically about promotion. So in our analysis, we define a promotion to be you start from one of these position-specific coaches, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, defensive backs coach. The next level up is offensive defensive coordinator, and the next level up is head coach. And so these levels we determined by their relative prestige, visibility on the field in sports journalism and commentary, and also by looking at a few salary dumps of public schools. But I think they're pretty commonly known for people who are knowledgeable about sports. And so overall, considering all of the coaches who have been at the same school for at least 5 years, so we wanted to give some amount of time to for a theoretical promotion to happen, 30.7% of white coaches who have been at a single school for 5 years have been promoted, so advanced on one of these 3 tiers, compared to only 13% of Black coaches. And so again, a natural question to ask is how much does the position play into this, right? We know that running backs coaches and defensive backs coaches are much more likely to be Black than, say, quarterbacks coach or head coach or offensive coordinator. Maybe running backs coaches are just less likely to get promoted. But this is not true at all. Even when you control for the starting position of these coaches, this discrepancy exists, and in some cases it's really, really large. So running backs coaches, for example, 24% roughly of white running backs coaches have been promoted compared to only 7% of Black running backs coaches. You see similar trends with linebacker coach, defensive line coach, defensive backs coach, wide receivers, offensive line. It is true for every position in our data set. So yeah, I think this points to some evidence that there are significant racial disparities in both representation and mobility promotion when it comes to college football coaching. I wanted to wrap up by coming back to this coaching history of Matt Rule. And now with the stats that I've just presented, you might want to think about how unlikely it is for a Black coach to have had the same trajectory as Matt Rule, starting from a Division III school as a low-level position coach, um, multiple promotions, switching schools, moving up in the divisions, and finally, eventually landing as a head coach of the Panthers. There's a lot of obstacles against a Black coach accomplishing this same trajectory. So I've left out a lot of experiments that we've done on switching schools, how likely that is depending on race and other things like that. But we still have a lot more to do. So one thing we wanted to look at is if a school has some number of Black coaches already on their coaching staff, does that impact whether they're more likely to hire another Black coach, or does it impact the likelihood of promotion? Another thing that I mentioned before was to add some more information to our data set about the salary information of the coaches that are at public schools. And finally, do some analysis by geographic region, which we haven't done yet. Okay, so I think that's all I wanted to talk about. If you're interested in our data set for the first project, it's available at this GitHub link, and I'm happy to take questions.
So just as a reminder, we're very happy to take questions. Mohit's very interested in understanding reaction and other directions that he could take his work in and so on. So please just type your questions into the Q&A tool. We do have one question at the moment from Brant, who I think you answered this in the talk, actually, probably 3 minutes after he asked this, but why not? What are the demographics of commentators, and how does that affect their commentary? That is, how many of them are people of color?
Yeah, so I did answer this for play-by-play commentators. Only 3 of the 75 play-by-play commentators are Black, but there are other types of commentators, right? So in the NFL, there are analysts who talk about the game after it's happened or at halftime, and there's also like there are other people that talk about sports, sideline reporters, for example, and these disparities are not as bad for those types of commentators, but they still do exist, and the discrepancies are most clear for play-by-play commentators.
Great. We have another question from Ritika Roy, who asks, for the first project related to commentary, has the data shown any significant decrease in racial bias over time? You didn't actually talk about the time element there.
Yeah, so this was one of the things that we were most interested to look at when we first collected this data set, but unfortunately, we just didn't have enough representation of non-white players in like the 70s, 80s, and even most of the 90s to make any sort of large-scale conclusions about the behavior of the commentators over time. We did do some analysis on the region of the, especially at the college football level, and found that this kind of bias was most prevalent in, I believe, like Southern college football broadcasts. But again, there was not enough data over all of these time periods to make any real conclusions.
Okay, I have a very interesting question for you from Matthew Gregory. He's asking if it has been considered to analyze statistics based on racial factors that aren't binary. For example, might Black people with darker skin have different statistics than Black people with lighter skin?
Yeah, so we did not consider doing this analysis because we were relying on this crowdsourcing platform to collect these perceived race labels. And one real challenge when dealing with this is that um, the more options we give to the workers, the less agreement they're going to have. We yeah, we wanted to make the task as simple as possible for them, and so we didn't try and do any sort of non-binary analysis. But that would be very interesting if you can figure out how to properly formulate the crowdsourced task, or get another way in which to get these labels for the players.
Great. And to the audience, I apologize if I butcher your names. Marcin Knara asks whether it might be interesting to analyze the financial backgrounds that these athletes have before they entered the NFL, and then further break it down by white versus non-white.
Yeah, that would be extremely interesting. Again, similar to the answer to the previous question, here we were really limited by like what we can reasonably expect one of these crowd workers to give us. And so if we wanted to examine the financial background of each of these thousands of players, there needs to be, at least some sort of common repository where we can find this information. A lot of the players, don't have Wikipedia articles. They might have only played for a single season, and so that information is not available for many players, and for others, it might not be in a standard place. So yeah, I agree. In principle, it's very interesting, but the challenge is really in getting this information into some sort of standardized format. But if that's possible, that would be really interesting.
Great. Bulat Bash asks, can comparison be made to other sports? As he points out, baseball might have as much or even more data than football.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm not actually familiar with any related work in baseball, although I agree that, yeah, there are likely more games that we could draw on. But the same kind of analysis with basically the same conclusions has been shown in soccer, and also in basketball to some extent. And so, yeah, this is not, oh, and also in tennis, I should mention. And I think some of the related papers that I pointed out also reference the gender bias issues in sports commentary. Those are also, especially in tennis, they've been very well studied in terms of, the types of questions that male tennis players get asked in post-game interviews versus female players. Female players tend to get asked much more about their families and personal life than male players. So there's a lot of related work here. Our work here is just an instance of trying to scale this up to a large data set.
Okay. Our next question comes from Robert Farr, and he's asking, as automated transcription becomes more widely adopted by newsrooms, could you envision other news coverage use cases like bias in interviews of politicians or celebrities?
Yeah, I think even if you look at Google's transcription service, it's become significantly better over even just the last year. So at the time we did this study to now, it's improved like noticeably. So I do think there are lots of applications that can be used for kind of real-time analysis of what people are saying. I'm not familiar with any work that's doing that right now, but it is maybe even possible with the current technologies that we have. So it would be cool to look into that.
Great. So I have another question from Matthew Gregory, who's asking, on the topic of the crowdsourcing platform, was it considered to use any software to determine race instead of human choice? I believe there are databases online where images can be found based on player name for analysis.
Yeah, we thought about this, but there are many issues with these systems, and you should remember that our source for these images was whatever is returned by Google Images. So there's a lot of pictures where the player's skin is not very visible, or many different angles, lighting conditions. Most of them are shots of the players in like the middle of a game. So it's not like we have a perfect headshot of all of these players. And even still, I think it's more reliable to have labels from actual humans for something like perceived race rather than a machine classifying. We don't know if it makes some systematic errors with certain features of the image. So I think it's just more reliable to have actual humans do this task.
Great. So another question from Ritika Roy. She's asking how the underlying distribution of the US population might attribute to some of the imbalance in the sample distribution in the teams. In fact, she points out 63% of the overall US population is non-Hispanic white and 13.4% are Black.
I think here we're looking at a subset of the population, specifically like NFL players, in which 70% of the players are non-white, and so it's interesting to have these significant discrepancies between the player population, the coaching population, the commentary population, and none of them really is similar to the overall US population breakdown. There are also other things that are kind of related to this, like coaches are oftentimes former players, so you might expect to see a higher Black representation in coaches just because the majority of players are Black. And I'm not sure what the case is for commentators, but yeah, I mean, it's going to be an issue if the demographics are this different between all of these different populations that are all centered around the single sport. So I'm not sure if that answered that question, but yeah.
Okay. Ivan Rudaval asks, is it possible to calculate how controversial a player is, presumably using your machine learning and natural language processing techniques? And if so, would it be possible to investigate the association between how controversial a player is and their career progression?
I'm not quite sure what the definition of controversial here is. I assume you could maybe define this as a player who is described by commentators in maybe both a lot of negative and positive frames. So interestingly, the majority of mentions of players are they don't have any sentiment at all, right? Because the majority of the time, these commentators are talking about what the player is doing in the game. So something like Tom Brady threw a pass to the wide receiver, that is considered to have neutral sentiment. But maybe a controversial player might be described more polarizing terms more often than other players. Yeah, in terms of career progression, we do have that data for the players, like what teams they've all been on. But we don't have data on like whether they were starting on those teams or whether they were on the bench or a practice squad or something like that. So you would probably have to collect additional labeled data for some large scale analysis to be possible. But yeah, I mean, if you define controversial in this way, it could be interesting to look at whether the way in which commentators describe a player impact how their career progresses. It's just, I think, a little hard to get the data for doing that properly.
Great.
I guess that's what I've been saying for every question. It's hard to get the data.
Well,
But
that's a theme, and unfortunately, that crosses a lot of areas of machine learning.
right,
Yeah, but it's cool the power that the technology has when you have the data and can get the data.
right.
Speaking of getting the data, this isn't really a question, but Marcin Canara um, does suggest a way to analyze the financial backgrounds of players by finding towns and cities they came from, and then basing the data on information like average household income in those areas and so on. A
Yeah,
lot of work, but a great thought. Yeah.
yeah, that I feel like we probably are more likely to get information on, yeah, the hometown of the players than, yeah, much more specific information on their families, like financial records. So yeah, that's a maybe a reasonable proxy for this information.
So at this point, I have no open. Well, one. Sorry, I have one open question from the audience. I was going to ask you a question, but I'll wait. So this one comes from Abhirup Mukherjee, who asks, is there any interest in analyzing this data and the biases being investigated by geographical location and correlating the findings with the demographic or even the political makeup of that location?
Yeah, so we are very interested in doing this for the coaching work that I was talking about in the second half. We are planning to do this. We're actually in the process of collecting this kind of geographical information for each of the schools. This again is like one of the just boring manual processes of this project, is that for every one of these 700 schools, we would like to, get information as to what state it's in, and maybe some higher level information about the region. And a lot of the time, it's hard to automate these things. So yeah, it's a slow process, but that's definitely something we're trying to do. We tried to do it for the player analysis, but yeah, we ran into the same problem. It's just too laborious to get this fine-grained geographic information. So hopefully, yeah, we will have some analysis by region on the coaching project in the future.
That's great. So my question, since nobody else has come up with one yet, would be, can you imagine a way in which the types of analyses that you're doing could be used to help address this problem of these discrepancies? And if so, what would you recommend to the various coaches and sports folks that are on the line?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I'm qualified to answer this question, but of course we would like these the results of these studies to be I don't know, publicized to the people who are actually in charge of coming up with rules like the Rooney Rule, which clearly has been ineffective because it tries to address the problem at the surface in just the NFL and kind of ignores the entire pipeline of how a coach actually gets to the point where they can even be considered for a position as a head coach. Because you might get a lot of white coaches who have extensive coaching records in college, and maybe it's very hard for a black coach, clearly with the results that we already have presented, to get a similar record, right? So if you just analyze these records side by side, you might be incentivized to, if you want to hire the coach with the most experience, choose the white coach. But there are all these roadblocks to black coaches achieving the same kind of records in college that they're not being considered by something like the Rooney Rule. You would hope that that kind of rule is also implemented maybe in college as well, especially Division III, where we see the most discrepancies. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what policies should be enacted in response to this, but like some of these results have not been, found before, right? So this stuff about promotion, we couldn't find any prior work that looked at this at the scale. So maybe many of these problems are just not widely known, or they're known by a subset of people who are in college football, like that career. But yeah, I think once we know about this problem, then we can start addressing it. But I don't have those.
No, it wasn't a fair question. I trust your own dean to
No
ask you an
problem.
unfair question.
It is a reasonable question. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I mean, the Rooney Rule is I guess it was at least some attempt to address the issue, but um, yeah, it's not clear what stronger version of this rule needs to be implemented, or how it needs to be passed down into the colleges to actually have the effect that it was intended to have.
Oh, we had a late breaking question for you um, from Rohan Raghuram, who's asking whether the recent success, both individual and team, of non-white quarterbacks in the NFL, could that change how general managers and executives in general perceive the quarterback position? And I think this is tied a little bit to your question about timelines and how things have changed over the years, right? Could there also be a shift in the sentiment used to describe non-white quarterbacks?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, especially over the last 2 years. Maybe there's been a huge change in, like, the most successful quarterbacks have also been ones that are associated with things that traditionally were like back in the 80s at least would have made a quarterback forced to be shifted over to some other position. So mainly in terms of their mobility, their speed, their ability to run and escape tackles and stuff like that. This is now finally being considered a huge benefit for at the quarterback position, and quarterbacks that don't have these skills are now being viewed, I guess, a little more negatively. So it's very interesting to see how this transition has taken place over the last couple of years. And yeah, I do think it has a lot of promise for increasing the representation at the quarterback position. It's really great to see that now we have all of these examples of minority quarterbacks that are succeeding, and they're also forming good role models for players down the line in college or high school, so that they can also succeed at this position regardless of what race they are. So that in the 80s and 70s was definitely not the case. There are several interviews that I maybe could recommend listening to that go over the experiences of Black quarterbacks at those times and how hard it was to even be considered for the job, let alone keep it despite whatever success they had on the field.
Okay, I have one more question for you at this point from Rita again. She's asking whether it would be useful to consider any additional features like win-losses when analyzing the promotion and career trajectory of the coaches.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this is definitely something that we should maybe add into our data set, like the record of the team during a particular season. But there is a challenge when you look at, because there's not just one coach, right? There's like 20 something coaches per season per team. And so it's not clear that any one coach contributed, a certain number of wins or losses to the overall team's record. So it is a little unclear if you can draw correlations between the team's record and the kind of career trajectory of a particular coach. Of course, head coaches get assigned most of the blame. They also get paid the most, so it kind of makes sense. But in reality, all the other coaches do play a role, but it's kind of more specialized, right? The running backs coach is only responsible for coaching the running backs, which are realistically maybe 2 or 3 or 4 players on the team. So it might be a little unfair to judge them based on the overall team's record. So you might need more fine-grained statistics to answer that. And maybe some of those things are available, and we can get it for many of these teams. So that is a good idea that we can consider in the future.
Great. At this point, I have no more questions for you, Mohit, and I won't ask any more obnoxious ones, so at least not today. So I just like, on behalf of the audience, to thank you very much for your presentation. I think this has been fascinating. I learned an incredible amount. I have to admit, I know nothing about football, but I think even those who care passionately about football learned some things today, and really appreciate your bringing this, taking the time and bringing this work to our attention. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great. And yeah, I appreciated all the questions.
And thank you again to the audience, especially those of you who hung in. We have over half the audience still here at the end of the Q&A. So thank you all for coming. Okay.